Imagine a dusty plain in central Greece where history's most invincible army is about to face its apocalypse. For nearly 2 centuries, one word had struck fear into the hearts of every Greek warrior: Sparta. These were the descendants of Leonidas, the heirs of Thermopylae, soldiers who had crushed Athens and bent every Greek city-state to their iron will. They had never lost a major land battle in living memory. Their reputation alone could end wars before they began. But on this scorching July day in 371 BC, a small force from the city of Thebes is about to do the impossible. Armed with revolutionary tactics that would change warfare forever, led by a philosopher general who believed that strategy mattered more than strength, they're preparing to shatter the myth of Spartan invincibility in one brutal, bloody afternoon. Welcome to Leuctra, where one brilliant mind would prove that sometimes genius beats glory. Before we analyze the tactics that shattered Spartan invincibility, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. We are building a community dedicated to the brutal truths of history, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Also, I want to hear from you in the comments. Was the Spartan defeat at Leuctra inevitable, or was it purely due to Epaminondas' genius? Let me know your thoughts. Now let's march to the battlefield. The year was 371 BC, and the Greek world lived under the shadow of Spartan domination. For 3 decades since their crushing victory over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, Sparta had ruled Greece with an iron fist, not as a benevolent leader, but as a tyrant drunk on its own power. This Spartan hegemony, as historians would call this dark period, was marked by arrogance, brutality, and a complete disregard for the independence of other Greek states. Sparta had transformed from the heroic defender at Thermopylae into the oppressor that Greece had learned to hate and fear in equal measure. Their soldiers were considered invincible, their phalanx unbreakable, their military system the most formidable the ancient world had ever produced. No one dared to challenge them openly because no one believed they could win. But one city refused to bow. Thebes, an ancient Boeotian city with a proud history, had suffered particularly brutal treatment under Spartan rule. In 382 BC, during peacetime and under the pretense of friendship, Spartan forces had treacherously seized the Cadmea, Thebes' sacred citadel, installing a pro-Spartan oligarchy and crushing the city's independence. For 3 bitter years, Thebes endured foreign occupation and tyranny, its democratic government dissolved, its best citizens killed or exiled. But in the winter of 379 BC, a group of exiled Theban patriots, led by 2 extraordinary men named Pelopidas and Epaminondas, staged a daring liberation. Disguised as women, they infiltrated the city during a festival, murdered the pro-Spartan rulers in a coordinated midnight assassination, and roused the population to revolt. The surprised Spartan garrison, finding itself besieged inside the very fortress it had held, was forced to surrender in humiliation. This dramatic liberation sent shockwaves through Greece and ignited a conflict that historians call the Theban-Spartan War. Sparta could not tolerate such defiance, such a stain on its reputation. Over the next 8 years, Sparta launched repeated invasions of Boeotia, attempting to crush Theban independence and restore its authority. But each time the Thebans resisted with growing confidence and skill. They formed the Boeotian League, a confederation of central Greek cities under Theban leadership, creating a unified military force. More importantly, they developed something revolutionary, an elite military unit unlike anything Greece had ever seen, composed of 300 warriors bound together not just by training, but by love itself. the Sacred Band of Thebes, consisting of 150 pairs of male lovers who fought side by side, each willing to die rather than show cowardice before their beloved. Under the leadership of Pelopidas, this sacred band achieved something previously unthinkable. In 375 BC at the Battle of Tegea, just 300 Theban warriors encountered 2 Spartan regiments, totaling over 1,000 men. Rather than flee, Pelopidas formed his men into a tight wedge and charged directly at the Spartan commanders. In the brutal hand-to-hand combat that followed, the sacred band killed both Spartan generals and broke through their formation, routing a force more than 3 times their size. For the first time in generations, Spartans had been defeated in open battle by an inferior force. The myth of Spartan invincibility had its first crack, and the Greek world took notice. While Pelopidas was forging the sacred band into a lethal weapon, his contemporary and friend Epaminondas was studying warfare itself, asking fundamental questions that no one else dared to ask. Born around 410 BC into an aristocratic but impoverished Theban family, Epaminondas had received an exceptional education from Lysis of Tarentum, a Pythagorean philosopher. Unlike the typical Greek warrior, Epaminondas approached battle as an intellectual problem requiring creative solutions. He was a man of profound culture, renowned eloquence, and absolute moral integrity, known throughout Greece for his personal modesty and incorruptible character. He lived simply, remained unmarried, and devoted his life entirely to Thebes. But beneath this philosopher's exterior beat the heart of a military revolutionary who would change warfare forever. By 371 BC, the conflict between Sparta and Thebes had reached a critical juncture. The Greeks, exhausted by constant warfare, attempted yet another general peace conference. The terms were based on the King's Peace of 387 BC, also known as the Peace of Antalcidas, which had been guaranteed by the Persian Empire and which recognized the autonomy of individual Greek city-states. Both Sparta and Athens agreed to sign. But when the Theban representative Epaminondas stepped forward to take the oath, he insisted on signing not just for Thebes, but for the entire Boeotian League. The Spartan king Agesilaus II, recognizing this as Theban ambition to dominate Boeotia the way Sparta dominated the Peloponnese, flew into a rage and refused. Epaminondas, calm and defiant, responded that Sparta signed for all of Laconia, so Thebes would sign for all of Boeotia. When Agesilaus struck Thebes from the treaty, Epaminondas walked out of the conference. War was now inevitable. The Spartan leadership was outraged by this insolence and determined to make an example of Thebes that would terrify Greece back into submission. They ordered King Cleombrotus the who was already in Phocis with a substantial army of about 10,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, to immediately invade Boeotia and destroy Theban power once and for all. Cleombrotus, a competent if not brilliant commander, was confident. His army included roughly 700 Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, the elite warriors who had trained for war since age 7, along with thousands of allies from across the Peloponnese. This was a formidable force led by a Spartan king who carried the weight of centuries of military dominance behind every command. When news arrived that a Spartan army was marching to destroy their city, Thebes found itself in a desperate position that would have made any other Greek state immediately sue for peace. Epaminondas hastily assembled approximately 6,000 Boeotian infantry and some cavalry, drawing from Thebes and whatever allies from the Boeotian League would stand with them. They were outnumbered nearly 2-1, facing the most feared military machine in the Greek world, commanded by a Spartan king who had never known defeat. Most of Epaminondas' allied contingents were unreliable at best, city militias with little stomach for fighting Sparta, who might flee at the first sign of trouble. The smart move, the safe move, would have been to retreat behind Thebes' walls and endure a siege. No one would have blamed them. But Epaminondas was not interested in safe moves or rational surrender. He understood something profound that would define this moment, that reputation itself was a weapon, and that Sparta's greatest strength was the psychological advantage of invincibility. Every Greek soldier stepped onto the battlefield against Sparta already half defeated, believing deep in his soul that Spartans could not be beaten. If Thebes retreated without fighting, that myth would grow stronger and Theban independence would slowly suffocate under Spartan pressure. The only way to break Sparta's stranglehold over Greece was to face them in open battle and win so decisively that the entire Greek world would see that Spartans were mortal after all. It was an insane gamble, a calculated risk that required absolute confidence in a revolutionary tactical plan that had never been tested on this scale. Epaminondas called a council of the Boeotarchs, the elected military commanders of the Boeotian League, and laid out his case. The debate was fierce and divided. Many argued for caution, for retreat, for any option other than facing certain annihilation on an open battlefield. But Epaminondas, with his renowned eloquence and moral authority, swayed them. He promised that he had a plan, a completely new approach to warfare that would turn Sparta's own strengths against them. He asked them to trust him, to trust the Sacred Band, and to trust that courage combined with innovation could achieve the impossible. By the narrowest of margins, the Boeotarchs voted to give battle. They would meet the Spartans at Leuctra, a small village in southern Boeotia, on a relatively flat plain that could accommodate both armies. The site itself held symbolic weight. Leuctra was where, according to ancient legend, 2 local maidens had been violated by Spartan officers centuries earlier, their father cursing Sparta with eventual destruction. Whether Epaminondas believed in such omens or simply understood the psychological value of fighting on ground associated with Spartan injustice, he chose to make his stand there. It would be on the plain of Leuctra that Thebes would either secure its freedom or be erased from the map. There would be no retreat, no second chances, one battle, one afternoon, one roll of the dice on which the fate of Greece itself would turn. As his vastly outnumbered army assembled on the plain, Epaminondas revealed the tactical innovation that would revolutionize warfare and be studied by military commanders for the next 2,000 years. To understand his genius, one must first understand the conventional Greek battle of that era. A rigid, almost ritualistic form of combat that had changed little in centuries. 2 phalanxes of heavily armoured hoplite infantry would line up facing each other across an open field, usually 8 to 12 ranks deep, forming continuous rectangular formations. The strongest, most experienced warriors were always positioned on the right wing of the formation because each hoplite carried his large round shield on his left arm, protecting himself and the man to his left. This created a natural weakness on the right side of each soldier, and formations would instinctively drift rightward as men sought the protection of their neighbour's shield. Therefore, both armies would position their best troops on their right wing, hoping to break through the enemy's weaker left. The battle would proceed predictably. At a signal, both phalanxes would advance at a walk, maintaining their formation, until they crashed together in a horrific collision of bronze shields and spear points. The initial clash was called the shock, where the front ranks would stab at each other with their 6 to 8 foot spears. Once most spears were broken, the battle would devolve into the Odysmos, the great pushing match, where the mass of men would literally shove against the enemy shield wall, trying to create gaps or break their cohesion. Whichever formation maintained its discipline and pushed harder would eventually crack the enemy line, at which point the losing side would break and run, and the real slaughter would begin in the pursuit. It was brutal, direct, and entirely predictable, a test of stamina, discipline, and numerical superiority more than tactical cleverness. Sparta had perfected this system to an art form. Their soldiers trained from childhood to maintain formation under the most horrific pressure, to never break ranks, to push forward with mechanical discipline while their comrades fell around them. Their traditional battle tactic was simple and devastatingly effective. Form a phalanx slightly deeper than the enemy, perhaps 12 ranks instead of 8, and simply grind them down through superior discipline, stamina, and the sheer weight of their formation. For 2 centuries, this approach had been virtually unstoppable. Why would anyone try something different when the traditional method always won? Epaminondas dared to ask the revolutionary question: what if conventional tactics were actually a liability when facing a stronger opponent? What if you could use the enemy's own expectations against them? His answer was the oblique order, a formation so radical that it violated every accepted principle of Greek warfare. Rather than distributing his limited forces evenly across the line to create a continuous front, Epaminondas would deliberately create an unbalanced formation. He would refuse his right and centre, holding them back in an echeloned, staggered line at an angle, keeping them out of immediate contact with the enemy. These weaker sections would advance slowly or not at all, buying time and fixing the enemy in place without committing to a serious fight. Meanwhile, on his left wing, Epaminondas would mass an unprecedented concentration of force, stacking his best troops 50 ranks deep, perhaps even deeper in some accounts, creating a massive human battering ram. This was unheard of. The deepest Greek phalanxes were typically 12 ranks, maybe 16 in exceptional circumstances. 50 ranks was insane, a monstrous column that abandoned all pretense of a balanced line. At the very tip of this colossal formation, leading from the front, would be the Sacred Band of Thebes, the 300 elite warriors under Pelopidas, the finest fighters in all of Greece. These men would form the spear point of a human avalanche aimed at one specific target, the Spartan right wing, where King Cleombrotus and the elite Spartiate warriors would inevitably position themselves according to centuries of tradition. The brilliance of the plan was in its paradox. By refusing his weaker troops from battle and massing everything on the left, Epaminondas would actually be violating the fundamental tactical principle that you put your strongest troops on the right, where they could exploit the enemy's natural weakness. He was deliberately doing the opposite, creating an asymmetrical battle where only one section of the line would truly engage. If his massive left wing could crush the Spartan right before his own weakened centre, and right collapsed under pressure, he would win. If not, his entire army would be surrounded and annihilated. It was brilliant, desperate, and utterly dependent on the speed and shocking power of that initial blow to the Spartan elite. Everything hinged on the Sacred Band's courage and the sheer mass of the deep phalanx behind them. Across the plain, King Cleombrotus deployed his forces in the time-honoured Spartan tradition, the same formation that had dominated battlefields for generations. His army stretched across the field in a continuous line, probably about 12 ranks deep across most of the formation, with his finest troops positioned exactly where Epaminondas knew they would be. On the right wing, the place of honour. Here stood the 700 Spartiates, the elite full citizens of Sparta, surrounded by King Cleombrotus and his royal guard. These were the most feared infantry in the world, men who had trained every day of their lives since childhood for this exact moment, whose society existed solely to produce perfect soldiers. Their red cloaks, their lambda-emblazoned shields, their perfectly maintained bronze armor gleaming in the July sun. Everything about them radiated confidence and terror in equal measure. The Spartan cavalry, about 1,000 horsemen, were positioned in front of the main battle line, traditional screening forces meant to skirmish with the enemy cavalry before the infantry engaged. However, Spartan cavalry was notoriously inferior to their infantry. Sparta's military culture was built around the hoplite, and their horsemen were generally poorly trained, more of an afterthought than a serious military arm. The rest of Cleombrotus's line consisted of allied forces from across the Peloponnese, Corinthians, troops from Elis, from various smaller cities that fought under Spartan command. These were solid soldiers, but they were not Spartans, and everyone knew that when the real fighting started, it would be the Spartiate elite who would win or lose the battle. As Cleombrotus observed the Theban deployment, he must have felt confident, perhaps even dismissive. The Thebans were outnumbered, their allies were unreliable, and they were facing Sparta's finest on ground that offered no defensive advantages. Even if Epaminondas tried some clever maneuver, Spartan discipline and superior numbers would grind them down in the Othismos. This would be another routine Spartan victory, another demonstration of military supremacy that would put Thebes back in its place. The only unusual element was the strange, deep formation on the Theban left wing, but that merely meant they were weak everywhere else. When the Spartan right wing inevitably broke through the Theban left, they could wheel and roll up the entire Theban army from the flank. It seemed almost too easy. What Cleombrotus failed to understand was that he was no longer fighting a conventional battle. He was facing a mind that had studied warfare from a completely different perspective, that had identified the fatal flaw in traditional tactics and designed a counter that would exploit it ruthlessly. The Spartan formation was perfect for a traditional engagement, but Epaminondas wasn't offering a traditional engagement. He was offering a focused, overwhelming assault on the one point where victory would shatter the entire enemy army. The death of the Spartan king and the destruction of the Spartiate elite. Everything else was window dressing. The battle opened, as Greek battles typically did, with a cavalry engagement. The Spartan horsemen, about 1,000 strong, trotted forward to engage their Theban counterparts and drive them from the field before the infantry lines met. This was supposed to be a formality, a preliminary skirmish to clear the flanks and allow the main battle to proceed unhindered. The Spartan cavalry had never been exceptional, but they were serviceable, and they vastly outnumbered the Theban horse. In a typical engagement, the cavalry would trade charges, throw a few javelins, and eventually one side would withdraw, having established dominance. It was rarely decisive, but the Theban cavalry was not typical. Unlike Sparta, which devoted all its military resources to infantry training, Thebes had developed skilled horsemen, riders who trained regularly and had become genuinely formidable. More importantly, they were fighting for their homes, for their families, for their city's very survival, with a desperate intensity that mercenary cavalry could never match. When the two cavalry forces collided in a swirling melee of dust, shouting men and panicked horses, the Thebans fought with a fury that took the Spartans completely by surprise. Within minutes, the Spartan cavalry broke, scattering in disorder. But they didn't just retreat. In their panic, they fled directly backward, crashing into their own infantry lines in a chaos of rearing horses and cursing men. The carefully maintained Spartan formation on the right wing, the elite troops who were supposed to advance in perfect order, suddenly found themselves dealing with hundreds of terrified horses and demoralized riders streaming through their ranks. The disruption was immediate and severe. Officers shouted orders trying to restore formation. Hoplites pushed and shoved to close gaps. The entire right wing of the Spartan army descended into temporary confusion. The perfectly maintained Phalanx, Sparta's greatest tactical asset, was compromised before the infantry engagement had even begun. Epaminondas, watching from his position at the head of the Theban left wing, saw his moment. The Spartan right was in disorder, their formation disrupted, their attention divided between maintaining ranks and clearing the panicked cavalry from their lines. They were vulnerable in a way they had rarely been in living memory. He would not give them time to recover, to restore their legendary discipline. The time for careful planning had ended. Now was the moment for violence and speed. He gave the command. The Sacred Band, with Pelopidas at their head, began to advance. Behind them, 50 ranks of Theban infantry began to move as one massive, terrifying block. The ground began to shake. The advance of the Theban left wing must have been one of the most terrifying sights in ancient warfare. This was not the typical measured walk of a Greek phalanx, maintaining formation as it crossed the field. This was something different, something new and horrifying. 50 ranks deep. A column of flesh and bronze more than 100 feet from front to back began moving toward the Spartan right wing with increasing speed. At its tip, the Sacred Band formed an arrow point. 300 of the finest warriors in Greece, men who had sworn oaths of love and death to one another, advancing shoulder to shoulder with their shields locked and their spears leveled. Behind them came wave after wave after wave of Theban hoplites, each man pressing forward, adding his weight and momentum to the human battering ram that Epaminondas had created. The formation advanced not in the traditional slow march, but at what the ancient sources describe as a run, or at least a rapid pace. Epaminondas understood that momentum was everything. The deeper the formation, the more weight it carried in the initial collision, but only if it maintained speed. A slow-moving deep formation was merely dense. A rapidly moving deep formation was an unstoppable force, a tidal wave of humanity that would hit the enemy line with physics on its side. As they closed the final yards, the Thebans would have raised the paean, the ancient Greek war cry, a terrifying ululation that announced their arrival like the howl of a storm. On the Spartan right wing, King Cleombrotus and his elite Spartiates were still trying to reform their lines after the cavalry disaster, when they looked up to see death bearing down on them. They had only seconds to brace for impact. The Spartan officers would have barked orders, the hoplites would have locked their shields into the wall, levelled their spears, and prepared for the collision they had trained their entire lives to withstand. These were Spartan warriors who had never broken, never fled, never known defeat. They would hold. They always held. And then the Theban formation hit them like a divine fist, and the world exploded into chaos and blood. The initial collision was catastrophic. The Sacred Band, running at full speed, struck the Spartan shield wall with their combined weight and momentum, and the physics of the impact were simply overwhelming. Individual Spartan hoplites, no matter how skilled or brave, found themselves facing not one or two opponents, but an entire wave of warriors, each adding their force to the man in front. Shields cracked, spears snapped, Men were simply crushed by the pressure of hundreds of bodies pressing forward from behind. The Othismos, the pushing match that Spartans were legendary for winning, became a grotesque parody as the sheer mass of the Theban formation, 50 men deep, began to simply drive through the Spartan line by weight alone. The front ranks of the battle descended into the most brutal form of hand-to-hand combat imaginable. Men stabbed over and under shields with their spears, desperately trying to find flesh. When spears broke, they drew their short swords and hacked at anything in reach. Wounded men fell and were trampled by their own comrades as the formation pressed forward relentlessly. The ground became slick with blood, making footing treacherous. The air filled with the screaming of dying men, the clash of bronze on bronze, and the terrible rhythmic shouting of the Thebans as they pushed forward step by agonizing step. The Sacred Band at the very tip of the assault fought with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. Each warrior fought not just for himself but for his lover standing beside him, and the psychological power of that bond in the most extreme crucible of combat proved devastating. To break, to show fear, to retreat would mean dishonor not just before your city, but before the man you loved more than life itself. They would die before yielding an inch, and that fanatical courage proved infectious, spreading through the entire deep formation behind them. These were not just soldiers following orders, they were believers in a cause, fighting for their homes against an oppressor they had learned to hate. At the center of the Spartan right wing, King Cleombrotus Therouna found himself in the heart of a catastrophe that his training and experience had never prepared him for. Around him, the elite Spartiates, the royal guard, the finest warriors in Greece, were being pressed backward by sheer, overwhelming force. Men he had known his entire life, warriors of legendary skill and courage, were falling, being cut down or crushed by the relentless Theban assault. The formation was bending, gaps were appearing, and for the first time in their lives, these Spartans were experiencing something utterly alien to their military culture. They were being beaten. As a Spartan king, Cleombrotus had no option to retreat or to seek safety. Spartan culture demanded that kings lead from the absolute front, that they die before their men if death was required. The sight of their king fleeing would have shattered Spartan morale instantly and irrevocably. So Cleombrotus did what his culture, his training, and his honor demanded. He fought. He pressed forward into the heart of the melee, his royal guard forming a desperate defensive circle around him, trying to rally the line, to restore order to chaos through personal courage and leadership. But courage alone could not overcome the mathematics of the situation. The Theban formation, with its unprecedented depth and momentum, had created a killing zone where individual heroism was irrelevant. The Sacred Band, having broken through the front Spartan ranks, now targeted the command center with ruthless precision. Led by Pelopidas, they fought their way toward the king's position, cutting down anyone in their path. The fighting around Cleombrotus became apocalyptic, the most intense combat on the entire battlefield, as his royal guard died to protect him, and the Thebans pressed forward with singular focus. In the brutal confusion of the melee, with men packed so tightly that they could barely swing their weapons, Cleombrotus I, king of Sparta, was struck down. Ancient sources don't agree on the exact details, whether it was a spear thrust, a sword cut, or simply being overwhelmed and trampled in the press of combat. What matters is that he fell, mortally wounded, and the word spread instantly through the Spartan ranks like poison. The king is down. The psychological impact was devastating, and immediate. Spartan warriors who had never flinched before any enemy suddenly found themselves fighting not just against overwhelming numbers, but against the horrifying realization that their king was dying or dead, and that they were actually losing. Around the fallen king, his royal guard fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they had already failed in their sacred duty. But the Theban pressure was relentless, inhuman in its intensity. More Spartiates fell, and suddenly the unthinkable was happening. The Spartan right wing, the elite of the elite, was breaking. The formation that had never yielded in 200 years of warfare was collapsing under the weight of Epaminondas' revolutionary tactics. Warriors began to step backward, then turn to retreat, then run, and the rout spread like a contagion. Within minutes, the proud Spartiate phalanx had disintegrated into a mass of fleeing men, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead or dying on the field. We are about to witness the moment the Spartan line breaks. But briefly, creating these deep dives requires accessing sources from all over the world, and keeping my connection secure is a priority. I use NordVPN to protect my personal data and browse privately. It is an essential tool for anyone using the internet today. If you want to secure your online privacy and support this channel at the same time, check the link in the description or the pinned comment for an exclusive deal. Now, let's return to Leuctra and watch the fall of an empire. With the Spartan right wing broken and King Cleombrotus dead or dying on the field, the battle's outcome was essentially decided, though fighting would continue across the plain. The destruction of the Spartiate elite had done exactly what Epaminondas had calculated. It had decapitated the Spartan army's command structure and shattered its morale in one decisive blow. The center and left of the Spartan army, composed primarily of allied troops from the Peloponnese, watched in absolute horror as the supposedly invincible Spartan warriors broke and fled. These allies had never wanted to be here in the first place. They fought out of fear and obligation, not love of Sparta, and now they saw that the emperor had no clothes, that the myth of invincibility was just that, a myth. Epaminondas refused right and center, which had held back from serious engagement, now began to press forward cautiously. They didn't need to achieve a dramatic breakthrough. They merely needed to maintain pressure and prevent an organized Peloponnesian counterattack, while the Sacred Band completed the destruction of Spartan power. The Peloponnesian allies, seeing the core of the Spartan army disintegrating before their eyes, made a collective calculation that survival mattered more than honor. These troops had no desire to die for Sparta's ambitions, and with the elite Spartiates broken, there was no reason to continue fighting. Unit by unit, contingent by contingent, the Allied forces began to withdraw from the field, refusing to engage seriously with the advancing Thebans. The rout was swift and brutal. Spartan warriors who had spent their entire lives training never to retreat, never to show their backs to an enemy, found themselves running for their lives across the plain toward a low hill where survivors attempted to rally and form some kind of defensive position. The Thebans pursued with controlled aggression, cutting down fleeing soldiers but maintaining enough discipline to avoid being drawn into a disordered chase that might expose them to counterattack. Epaminondas, even in the moment of total victory, maintained tactical control, understanding that a disciplined pursuit was far more valuable than a chaotic slaughter. When the fighting finally ended and both sides pulled back to assess the carnage, the scale of the Spartan disaster became horrifyingly clear. Ancient sources vary on the exact casualties, but the most reliable accounts suggest that Sparta lost approximately 1,000 men killed, possibly more, with some later accounts claiming as many as 4,000 total casualties, including wounded. But the truly catastrophic loss was among the elite Spartiates themselves. Approximately 400 full Spartan citizens lay dead on the field of Leuctra, including King Cleombrotus IV. To put this in perspective, at the start of the Peloponnesian War a century earlier, Sparta had possessed about 8,000 Spartiates. By 371 BC, due to demographic decline, inequality, and the rigid requirements of Spartan citizenship, that number had shrunk to perhaps 1,500 to 2,000. The loss of 400 in a single afternoon represented roughly 20 to 25% of Sparta's entire citizen warrior class, an absolutely catastrophic blow from which the Spartan military system would never recover. The Theban losses, by contrast, were minimal. Ancient sources suggest around 47 to 300 men killed, a remarkably light cost for such a decisive victory. The disparity in casualties was a direct result of Epaminondas' tactical genius. By refusing his weaker units from serious combat and concentrating overwhelming force at a single decisive point, he had achieved complete victory while exposing only a portion of his army to serious danger. It was perhaps the most efficient battlefield victory in classical Greek history, a triumph of intellect over brute force. The day after the battle, a strange and telling scene unfolded on the plain of Leuctra. The Spartans, or what remained of them, sent heralds to the Thebans requesting a truce to recover their dead. In Greek warfare, this was a formal admission of defeat. The side that controlled the battlefield and the bodies of the fallen was understood to be the victor. For Sparta, a state whose entire culture was built on military supremacy and the idea that Spartan warriors never lost, this was a moment of profound humiliation. For centuries, it had been other Greek states that sent heralds to Sparta, requesting permission to collect their dead. Now the roles were reversed, and every Greek who heard the news understood its significance. Epaminondas granted the truce with magnanimity, allowing the Spartans to retrieve their fallen king and the hundreds of citizens who had died with him. The Thebans erected a trophy on the battlefield, a traditional monument constructed from captured enemy armor and weapons, marking the site of their victory for all time. The trophy at Leuctra stood as a permanent reminder that Spartan invincibility had been a myth, shattered by Theban courage and tactical brilliance. The news of Leuctra spread across Greece with the speed of wildfire, and the reaction was seismic. In Athens, the longtime rival of Sparta, there was celebration mixed with concern, celebration that Sparta had finally been humbled, but concern that Thebes might now become an equally oppressive hegemon. In the Peloponnesian cities that had lived under Spartan domination for generations, the response was even more dramatic. Suddenly, rebellion seemed possible. If the Thebans could defeat Sparta, perhaps others could too. The psychological stranglehold that Sparta had maintained over Greece through reputation and fear was broken in a single afternoon. In Sparta itself, the news of the disaster provoked a crisis unlike anything the city had experienced in its history. When the messenger arrived bearing news of the defeat and the death of King Cleombrotus, the Spartan leadership faced a terrible dilemma. Their entire society was built on the myth of Spartan superiority, on the idea that their warriors were unbeatable. How could they maintain social stability when that myth had been so publicly destroyed? The Spartan ephors, the elected magistrates who wielded significant power, made a remarkable decision. They would suppress public mourning and attempt to maintain normalcy as if nothing had changed. Families were ordered not to publicly grieve for the dead. Life was to continue as if Leuctra had been a minor setback rather than a catastrophe. It was a desperate attempt at damage control that fooled no one, least of all the Spartans themselves. Epaminondas and the Thebans understood that their victory at Leuctra was merely the first step. To truly break Spartan power and ensure that Thebes would never again face Spartan aggression, they needed to strike at the very foundations of the Spartan system. In the winter of 370 to 369 BC, Epaminondas led a massive allied army of Boeotians and their newfound allies deep into the Peloponnese, directly into Laconia itself, Sparta's home territory. This was unprecedented. No enemy army had successfully invaded Laconia in living memory. The territory was considered nearly impregnable, protected by mountains and the reputation of its defenders. But now those defenders were shattered, their numbers depleted, their confidence broken. The psychological impact of foreign troops marching through Laconia, burning estates and threatening Sparta itself cannot be overstated. The city of Sparta famously had no walls because the Spartans themselves were supposed to be the city's walls. Now those human walls had been proven fallible, and the city lay vulnerable. Epaminondas brought his army within sight of Sparta, and for the first time in centuries, the Spartans huddled in their city in genuine fear of conquest. Only the approach of winter and the difficulty of besieging a city without proper walls prevented Epaminondas from attempting a direct assault. But he had made his point. Sparta was no longer invincible, no longer safe even in its own territory. The true masterstroke, however, came next. Rather than merely humiliate Sparta, Epaminondas sought to permanently destroy the economic and military foundation of Spartan power. The Spartan system depended absolutely on the Helots, the enslaved population of Messenia, who vastly outnumbered the Spartan citizens and who did all the agricultural labor that allowed Spartans to train full-time for war. The Helots were brutally oppressed, living under constant terror and periodic massacres designed to prevent rebellion. For centuries, they had been held in check by Spartan military might and the knowledge that any revolt would be crushed with extreme violence. In 369 BC, Epaminondas marched into Messenia with his army and did something revolutionary. He liberated the Helots and helped them rebuild their ancient capital, founding the city of Messene with massive fortification walls. After nearly 3 centuries of slavery, the Messenians were free, and they had a fortified capital that could resist Spartan attempts to reconquer them. The economic and military consequences for Sparta were catastrophic. Overnight, they lost roughly half their agricultural territory and the labor force that had sustained their military system. Spartan citizens, accustomed to being supported by Helot labor so they could focus entirely on warfare, suddenly found themselves economically vulnerable. The number of men who could afford to maintain the expensive hoplite equipment and devote their lives to training plummeted. Sparta's demographic crisis, already severe, became terminal. Epaminondas didn't stop there. He organized the Arcadian cities in the central Peloponnese into the Arcadian League, with a new federal capital at Megalopolis, specifically designed as a counterweight to Spartan power. He brokered alliances across Greece, building a network of states united in their determination to prevent Sparta from ever regaining its hegemony. Through a combination of military victories, strategic fortifications, and diplomatic brilliance, Epaminondas systematically dismantled the entire Spartan imperial system in less than 3 years. It was one of the most thorough strategic defeats in ancient history, all stemming from that single afternoon at Leuctra. The period from 371 to 362 BC is known to historians as the Theban Hegemony, when Thebes replaced Sparta as the dominant military power in Greece. Under Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes pursued an aggressive foreign policy, intervening in conflicts across the Greek world and projecting power from Thessaly in the north to the Peloponnese in the south. The Sacred Band, which had proven so decisive at Leuctra, continued to form the elite core of Theban military power, winning victory after victory and cementing Thebes' reputation as the new military innovator of Greece. In 364 BC, Pelopidas led an expedition to Thessaly to combat the growing power of the tyrant Alexander of Phaerae. In a battle at Kynos, the Thebans won a decisive victory, but Pelopidas himself was killed leading from the front in the thick of the fighting. His death was mourned across Greece, and he was given a hero's funeral in Thebes. But it deprived Epaminondas of his closest friend and most capable military partner. The partnership that had liberated Thebes and defeated Sparta was broken. In 362 BC, Epaminondas led another massive invasion of the Peloponnese to reassert Theban authority, which had begun to slip as various Greek states maneuvered for advantage. At the Battle of Mantinea, he once again employed his revolutionary oblique tactics against a coalition of Spartans, Athenians, and their allies. The battle was hard fought and ultimately victorious for Thebes, with the deep Phalanx once again proving decisive. But in the moment of victory, as Epaminondas led from the front as always, he was struck by a spear that pierced deep into his chest. Mortally wounded, he remained conscious long enough to learn that Thebes had won the battle, and then he died on the field, unmarried and childless, having devoted his entire life to his city. With Epaminondas' death, the Theban hegemony effectively ended. He had been the brilliant mind behind Theban strategy, the general whose tactical innovations had made their victories possible, the statesman whose vision had guided their policy. Without him, Thebes lacked the leadership to maintain its dominant position. The various Greek states signed yet another general peace treaty, essentially recognizing that no single city-state had the power to dominate all the others. Greece had fought itself to exhaustion, and the constant wars of hegemony had weakened all the major powers. This weakness would soon be exploited by an outside power that had been quietly watching and learning. Philip II of Macedon, who had spent his youth as a hostage in Thebes during its period of dominance, had studied Epaminondas' tactics and innovations closely. He would adapt the oblique order and the concept of massed shock cavalry to create the Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry that would conquer Greece and then the Persian Empire. The military revolution that Epaminondas had begun at Leuctra would reach its culmination under Philip and his son Alexander the Great. In a very real sense, the tactics that conquered the known world were born on the bloody plain of Leuctra. The Battle of Leuctra and its aftermath had consequences that echoed through Greek history and beyond. For Sparta, the defeat was absolutely catastrophic and permanent. The loss of 400 Spartiates in a single battle, combined with the liberation of Messenia and the loss of the Helot labor force, destroyed the foundations of the Spartan military system. Sparta would never again be a major military power. By the time of Philip II and Alexander the Great, Sparta was a second-rate power, clinging to memories of past glory but unable to field armies comparable to other Greek states. The rigid, conservative military culture that had made them dominant for 2 centuries proved unable to adapt to the new tactical realities that Leuctra had introduced. The demographic decline continued relentlessly. Without the economic foundation provided by Helot labor, fewer Spartan citizens could afford to maintain the lifestyle required for full citizenship. The population of Spartiates continued to shrink, and by the mid-4th century Sparta could barely field 1,000 citizen warriors, down from 8,000 a century earlier. Attempts at reform were blocked by conservative elements who clung to traditional ways, and Sparta slowly faded into military irrelevance. The city that had once made Greece tremble with a single red cloak now struggled to defend even its own territory. For Greek military thought, Leuctra represented a revolution comparable to the introduction of gunpowder or the tank. Epaminondas had proven that traditional symmetric tactics could be defeated by a symmetric innovation, that concentration of force at a decisive point was more valuable than even distribution, and that deep formations with proper momentum could break through even the most disciplined enemy. The oblique order became standard tactical doctrine, studied by every Greek commander and adapted to various situations. The idea that you could refuse part of your line from combat while concentrating overwhelming force elsewhere became a fundamental principle of military strategy that remains relevant to this day. The battle also demonstrated the value of combined arms tactics. Epaminondas' coordination of cavalry, heavy infantry, and the careful timing of his oblique advance showed that battles could be won through sophisticated planning and execution, not just courage and discipline. This represented a maturation of Greek military thought from the ritualistic phalanx collisions of earlier eras to something more flexible and intellectually sophisticated. Warfare was becoming a science as well as an art. On a broader level, Leuctra marked the beginning of the end for the classical Greek city-state system. The constant wars of hegemony, first Athenian, then Spartan, then Theban, had exhausted the Greek cities economically and demographically. The major powers had all been weakened, their citizen populations depleted by decades of constant warfare, their treasuries drained, their political systems strained by the demands of maintaining empires. This created a power vacuum that would be filled not by another Greek city-state, but by the kingdom of Macedon, a semi-Greek northern power with a different political system and fresh resources. Within a generation of Leuctra, Philip II would unite Greece under Macedonian hegemony, and his son Alexander would lead a united Greek-Macedonian army to conquer the Persian Empire. Epaminondas himself was remembered by later generations as one of the greatest commanders and statesmen of classical Greece, mentioned in the same breath as Pericles, Themistocles, and Leonidas. Ancient historians praised not just his tactical brilliance, but his personal character. Unlike many successful generals, he never sought personal enrichment or political tyranny. He remained poor throughout his life, living simply and devoting all his energy to Thebes. He was known for his eloquence, his philosophical training, his personal courage, and his absolute integrity. Even his enemies acknowledged that he was incorruptible and genuinely motivated by patriotism rather than personal ambition. The Roman historian Cornelius Nepos wrote that Epaminondas was the first man of Greece, praising his combination of military genius, moral virtue, and cultural sophistication. Cicero cited him as an example of how a truly great man combines military ability with moral philosophy. Plutarch praised his decisive leadership and his refusal to accept payment or honors beyond what he believed appropriate. In an era when successful generals often became tyrants or enriched themselves through corruption, Epaminondas stood out for his modesty and his genuine devotion to republican virtue. His tactical innovations were studied by military commanders for centuries. Hannibal, the great Carthaginian general, explicitly studied and adapted the oblique order in his victory at Cannae, where he used a variant of Epaminondas' tactics to destroy a much larger Roman army. Frederick the Great of Prussia studied ancient battles extensively and adapted the oblique order for 18th century warfare, using it to win battles against numerically superior enemies. Napoleon studied Leuctra and praised Epaminondas' concentration of force at the decisive point. The tactical principles first demonstrated at Leuctra, economy of force, concentration of strength, the value of asymmetric deployment, remain fundamental to military strategy in the modern era. The Battle of Leuctra also raises profound questions about the role of individual genius in history. Without Epaminondas, would the Thebans have dared to face Sparta in open battle? Would anyone have developed the oblique order, or would Greek warfare have continued in its traditional patterns until some outside force conquered them? The battle suggests that individual creativity and intellectual courage can change the course of history, that one brilliant mind asking the right questions at the right moment can shatter systems that seemed permanent and invincible. This is perhaps the most inspiring aspect of Leuctra. The Spartans were not defeated by superior numbers, better equipment, or economic advantages. They were defeated by an idea, by someone willing to question conventional wisdom and imagine a completely different approach to an ancient problem. Epaminondas looked at the traditional Phalanx battle, which had been fought the same way for centuries, and asked, why do we do it this way? What if we did something completely different? That intellectual courage, that willingness to challenge accepted doctrine, proved more powerful than 2 centuries of Spartan military tradition. The battle also demonstrates the limitations of conservative military thinking. The Spartan system had worked brilliantly for generations, and that very success became a trap. Why would you change tactics that had never failed? Why would you innovate when tradition had made you dominant? But this conservatism meant that when they finally faced a genuinely innovative opponent, they had no answer. Their entire military culture was built on perfecting a single system, and when that system was countered, they had no flexibility to adapt. The lesson is timeless. Past success is no guarantee of future victory, and the failure to innovate eventually leads to defeat. The Sacred Band of Thebes, which had been so instrumental at Leuctra, continued to serve as the elite core of the Theban army for another generation. They fought in every major Theban campaign, maintaining their reputation as the finest infantry in Greece. Their bond of love and loyalty continued to make them extraordinarily effective in combat, willing to fight to the death rather than retreat or show cowardice before their lovers. But in 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, the Sacred Band faced Philip II of Macedon and his son, the 18-year-old Alexander the Great. The Macedonian army, using tactics inspired by those Epaminondas had pioneered but adapted with innovations like the sarissa pike and combined cavalry infantry tactics, defeated the allied Greek forces. The Sacred Band, holding the critical position in the Theban line, refused to retreat even when the battle was clearly lost. They stood their ground and fought to the last man, all 300 dying where they stood rather than fleeing or surrendering. Philip II, surveying the battlefield after his victory, came upon the bodies of the Sacred Band, all lying in their ordered ranks where they had died together. According to Plutarch, he wept and said, "Perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything unseemly." He ordered them buried with honours on the spot, and their mass grave, marked by a stone lion monument, was rediscovered by archaeologists in 1890. The discovery of 254 skeletons buried in 7 rows confirmed the ancient accounts of their last stand. Even in death, the Sacred Band remained together, their bonds of love enduring beyond life itself. On a dusty plain in central Greece in 371 BC, One brilliant mind changed the course of history in a single afternoon. Epaminondas of Thebes looked at the most powerful military machine in the ancient world and saw not invincibility, but vulnerability. He understood that Sparta's greatest strength, their reputation, their tradition, their rigid discipline, could become their fatal weakness when facing someone willing to think differently. With revolutionary tactics, extraordinary courage, and the elite Sacred Band leading his assault, he shattered 2 centuries of Spartan dominance and rewrote the rules of warfare itself. The Battle of Leuctra teaches us that no empire lasts forever, that innovation defeats tradition, and that sometimes one person with a brilliant idea and the courage to execute it can change everything. Sparta, which had seemed eternal in its power, was broken in an afternoon and never recovered. Thebes rose to brief dominance before fading in turn. The cycle of rise and fall that defines all human empires played out on that battlefield, written in blood and bronze. But the tactical principles that Epaminondas pioneered, concentration of force, asymmetric deployment, the oblique order, those lived on, studied by Hannibal, by Frederick, by Napoleon, by military academies to this very day. The Sacred Band, fighting with bonds of love stronger than fear of death, proved that loyalty and morale can overcome superior numbers. Epaminondas, living simply and dying poor despite his victories, showed that greatness doesn't require personal enrichment or tyrannical ambition. Leuctra reminds us that courage, creativity, and integrity still matter, that one person refusing to accept the impossible can achieve the extraordinary. If you found this analysis of the Sacred Band and Spartan tactics valuable, make sure to like the video. It really helps the algorithm show this history to more people. And if you want to help me buy more books for the next documentary, you can now support the channel directly on Ko-fi. The link is down below. Until next time, remember, history's greatest lessons are written by those who dare to challenge the impossible. Stay curious,